Okay. Welcome, everybody, to the Humanist Canada webinar series. Tonight, we are having a presentation called Secularism in Canada, a Means for Maximum Freedom. And I'm pleased that Leslie Rosenblood is here to share his thoughts and his deep knowledge in this field. Leslie is a secular humanist and supporter of evidence-based decision-making, especially for public policy. Leslie is a humanist officiant, the secular chair at the Centre for Inquiry Canada, and the host of Podcast for Inquiry. He writes about secularism, religion, philosophy, free speech, vaccines, and other topics at Opinions and Questions. And we can put that website in the chat. He has 4 children, has run 2 marathons, and lives in Toronto. And so without further ado, I will stop sharing. And Leslie, I'm sure you want to share your screen. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you. Uh, let's see here. All right. You should be able to see my screen now, I hope.
Yes.
Wonderful. Right. All right, so welcome everybody. I'm here to talk tonight, as generally said, about secularism in Canada. So I'm going to give you a bit of a history, a bit of a context, and where we were, where we are, and hopefully where we're going. So I hope this is going to be both informative and entertaining for all of you. So I wanted to give you a little bit, tell you a little bit about myself before, as I start. I have been a secular activist for about 20 years now in Canada, and that activism takes basically 2 forms. One is through the Centre for Inquiry Canada. This is an educational charity which supports reason, compassion, and secular values. So this is what I consider to be my grassroots activism. This is changing the hearts and minds on the individual level. And also, I have been I'm one of the founding members and have been a policy advisor of the Canadian Secular Alliance since its inception about, I don't know, maybe 15 or so years ago. It's a nonprofit organization. It does public policy research and advocacy, and we support secular governance, separation of church and state, and neutrality of government in matters of religion. So this is more of a institutional level change, and I've been working on both over the course of my activism for the last 20 years. Now, since I'm going to be talking about secularism, I think it's really important that you understand what I mean when I say it, because it is a word that, like many words in the English language, have multiple definitions. So, secularism is the principle of government neutrality in matters of religion. So that means government should not favor one faith over another, religious belief over non-belief, or believers over non-believers, or the inverse. Government should be neutral. So a good way to think about this is that government of Canada, or really any government, if you're talking about secularism, government should neither support nor suppress religious expression amongst its populace. And this is the definition the definition of secularism used by the Centre for Inquiry Canada and the Canadian Secular Alliance. But there are other definitions, and you should be aware of them because they are also valid, just not the way I'm going to be using it today. So there is freedom of religion as well as freedom from religion. And I think both components are essential for a truly secular stance. The first same-sex marriage, for example, was due to freedom of religion. It was actually done in a church by a priest under through a means that hadn't been done in many decades. It was essentially a loophole, but it was also because of freedom of religion. That's how we got the first same-sex wedding in Canada. So often many people think of secularism as just freedom from religion, but really the principle applies both ways. Another definition is church and state separation. Again, perfectly valid definition. This is the one that is preferred in the United States of America and tends to be the most commonly held definition in Quebec. And these definitions, most of the time, they can be used interchangeably. They tend to arrive at the same conclusion. You'll be on the same side of debates and of history, and you'll have the same values. But that's not always the case. And I'll get to where they can lead to different, or these different definitions can lead to different conclusions a little bit later on in tonight's talk. Now, that's political secularism. There's also sociological secularism. So it's a term that talks about the secular world as opposed to the ecclesiastical world. It talks about the level of belief or its lack, the practice, how often people do or do not go to houses of worship to pray. So often when people say society is becoming more secular, what they mean is that belief in religion is becoming less prominent in society and in people's lives. And again, it's a perfectly valid way to use the term secularism, but sociological secularism is a very different concept than political secularism. And sometimes you'll find that people will use it as a synonymous with anti-religious bias. That's not accurate, but it's commonly done. So I want to make sure that you're aware of it. If you are truly secular, you're not anti-religion. You just don't think that religion should be treated differently. It shouldn't get special favors, nor should religious institutions or religious believers be discriminated against in any fashion. So let's take a look at secularism in practice. What does this mean on a day-to-day basis? Now, Canadians, by and large, we like to keep our politics and religion separate. We have no problem with people who are religious being involved with our politics, but we don't want them to be wearing their religion on their sleeve. And in fact, politicians tend to be penalized, at least at the federal level, if they are if too overtly religious, and that tends to be more of a penalty than if you don't go to church or temple or mosque at all. It's a generalization across the country, and there are exceptions, but that tends to be true. When new laws are introduced, even if they do have religious motivation behind it, it's generally not a justification. We don't have legislation today that have a biblical or Christian or any other faith as the justification for why these laws need to be passed. And that goes right back to even the introduction of Medicare. Tommy Douglas was a Methodist, devout Methodist, and was probably inspired by his faith to care about his fellow Canadians, and hence introduced Medicare. But when he introduced it, and when he was arguing for it, and when we were trying to get it passed, and involving all the negotiations that are involved with that, it was never because God said so or because we have to do this for any religious basis. It was Canadians trying to take care of each other. Now, let's contrast that with the United States. Religion plays an enormous role in US politics. Every politician, it seems, ends every public address and speech with God bless America. It is, on a practical level, nearly impossible for an open atheist to be elected in the States. Just a few years ago, Roe v. Wade was struck down, leading to the unavailability of abortions, even if medically necessary, in a large number of U.S. states, comprising a significant portion of the population. And now we have key figures in the government claiming that the U.S. is a Christian nation, and in the recent war declared on Iran, the Secretary of Defense was openly saying this was a holy war. Now, some things have gotten better in the United States. When the first Catholic president was elected, which was Kennedy back in the 60s, there was a large concern about whether his first initial loyalty was to the United States or to the Pope. When the second Catholic president was elected, Joe Biden, some people loved him, some people loathed him, but the fact that he was Catholic wasn't relevant and wasn't really part of the public conversation. So things have changed, some for the better, some for the worse. But let's take a look at secularism in theory. If you look at Canada, or sorry, if you look at the United States on paper, if you look at its constitution, it's actually quite secular. The Article 6 of the Constitution says that no religious test shall be required as a qualification to any office or public trust in the United States. That's pretty strong, I think, and I think that's a wonderfully secular statement. And the very famous First Amendment says, in part, that Congress shall make no law regarding an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So if we look at that, you would think that the United States was a very secular nation. It is in theory, but in practice, as we've seen, less so. Whereas Canada, not so much. If you look at our Constitution, we have the supremacy of God in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. That's right there in the preface, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. We have God keep our land glorious and free as one of the lines in our national anthem. And three of our provinces, Ontario, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, publicly fund a Catholic school system, which is a benefit that is enjoyed by no other denomination in Canada. So uh, these privileges to Catholic schools are constitutionally guaranteed in those provinces. All right. And so let's go back to Canada at its founding. How secular was Canada at that time? And unfortunately, I have to tell you that the answer is not at all. At its inception, Canada espoused a toxic blend of racism and religious bigotry. Only white male Christians were considered to be real Canadians. If we look at the laws that we have, they were largely inherited from England and France. So it's kind of a mix uh, of Catholic and Protestant laws and traditions, all Christian. If we take a look at some of the behaviors at the time, there was extreme anti-Chinese bias at the time. So if we look at the building of our national railway, Chinese workers were paid half the wages that white men got, and they were considered disposable. So they were given the most dangerous tasks. The Chinese Immigration Act demanded that Chinese people pay $50, which was then increased in 1903 to $500, which was 2 years' salary, just to enter Canada. This didn't have the desired effect of curbing the Chinese population in Canada, so we passed the Chinese Immigration Act in 1923. It's referred to today as the Chinese Exclusion Act. And lest you think that this was a cultural or linguistic bias that Canadians had, that people from China didn't speak the language or had trouble assimilating to Canadian cultural norms, it applied not just to Chinese nationals, but also to British citizens of Chinese ancestry. So we were anything but a welcoming and enlightened country at the time. Um, oh, sorry, my slides are bouncing all over the place. Not sure why. Uh, okay, so Western and Christian values were considered identical. Those were synonymous in the eyes of the people that led Canada in our early years. And this led to the founding of residential schools, the last of which closed only 30 years ago when I was in university. The Canadian policy was to civilize the savage through Christianization. And this horrific government policy was enthusiastically executed by various Christian churches of Canada. And there were other policies that started later that were also something that we should be recoiling at. The Duplessis orphans, or the children of sin, in the 1940s and 50s, children born to unwed mothers in Quebec were forcibly sent to Catholic orphanages 3 days after birth. Now, Notice orphanages. The mother was not dead, but she was unwed, so not suitable in the eyes of the Quebec government at the time to be a mother. Um, the Duplessis and then the Catholic Church then reclassified these orphanages as psychiatric hospitals. Why? Because that meant that these Catholic organizations, institutions, would get double the daily stipend because the government funding for a psychiatric hospital was much higher than for uh, uh, running an orphanage. Quebec offered compensation to these victims in 2006, so just 20 years ago, and in the order of $26 million. But in order to get any of that money, survivors had to sign a waiver declaring that they would not take legal action against the Catholic Church. So there was that's the protection for the church and the government providing that to excuse me to the church. I want to move to looking at our Constitution. So this is the highest document of the land. It was created in just 1982. So as far as the country is concerned, that's fairly recent, and this is now our highest law. And as I mentioned right there in the preamble, it says, whereas Canada is founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of God and rule of law. Now, I have a couple of issues with this preamble. One is you can interpret it two ways. If you interpret it as the supremacy of God and the rule of law, then it's logically incoherent because what is supreme? God is God supreme or the rule of law? Supremacy is not a concept that likes to be shared. Or you can interpret this as the supremacy of God, and then sort of as a secondary function, Canada was founded on the rule of law. Now, I have a bit more of a moral problem with that. Me personally, I'd much prefer rule of law to be a founding principle than obedience and the supremacy of the deity. But even if that weren't the case, it doesn't specify which God. Is it the Christian God? Is it the Catholic God? Is it the Protestant God, Jewish, Muslim God? If you're a Hindu and believe in many gods, you're kind of excluded about this. So I find it very divisive and something that is not a good way for us to start on our Constitution. Fortunately, although the preamble is symbolically significant, several Supreme Court rulings since 1982 have demonstrated that it has very little to no legal weight. So symbolically important, but not legally significant. And then it's contradicted by Section 2 of the Charter, which says that, among other things, everyone has the freedom of conscience and religion. And so if you've got the supremacy of God, that's not consistent with freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. The way this phrase came into the charter was very interesting. Pierre Trudeau, who was prime minister at the time, he stated that it is strange, and this is a direct quotation, strange so long after the Middle Ages that some politicians felt obliged to mention God in a constitution which is, after all, a secular and not a spiritual document. And the negotiations, it had to be included in order to get enough of the premiers to sign on. And I can only imagine the frustration he was feeling when Pierre Trudeau said, I don't think God gives a damn whether he's in the Constitution or not. But nonetheless, it is there, and we have to acknowledge that. I want to spend a few minutes talking about some of the most significant Supreme Court rulings since the Charter was established, because these have a huge effect on all of our lives. So in 1985, it was really the first major secular test of Canada's Constitution. And the name of the case is Big M Drug Mart, and it was about Sunday shopping. And uh, uh, basically, there was a challenge to the Ontario law that said that you had to close. You couldn't open your store on on Sunday. That was the day of rest. So the Ontario government, defending the law, said, "But we just want a day of rest. People shouldn't have to work 7 days a week. Think of the poor small businessman who has to work all the time." Now, this argument was rejected because when asked whether a small business owned by Jews, for example, uh, closed their shop because they were observant, if they closed their shop on Saturdays, could they then open on Sunday? And the answer came back, no, no, Sunday was the mandated day. The Supreme Court also noted that the legislation wasn't called Common Day of Rest, that the legislation was not called um, uh, uh, what wasn't called some relief for the small business person. It was called the Lord's Day Act. So they determined that it was a law that was designed to protect one religion, Christianity, and therefore it was not constitutional. And this was the first time in Canadian jurisprudence that the Supreme Court said that non-belief is equally protected under religious freedom. So this was quite momentous for that reason. It was interesting. They left the door open, the Supreme Court did, to a day of rest legislation. They were not ruling against that principle. But for various reasons that'll just take me too long to get into, efforts to establish one in various provinces in the intervening decades have either failed or they've been abandoned for one reason or another. Then a little over a decade ago, there was the Saguenay case. So Saguenay is a small city in the province of Quebec, and what happened there was the mayor always opened the municipal meetings with a Christian and usually Catholic prayer. A resident of Saguenay, who was an atheist, said he felt uncomfortable about that, and he was told he could wait outside. So he sued. And the Canadian Secular Alliance, which is one of the organizations I volunteer for, we were an intervener when this case eventually reached the Supreme Court. And ultimately, the court ruled that opening municipal meetings with a prayer was unconstitutional, and it barred them from doing that. So governments cannot be seen to endorse any particular faith, and the Supreme Court called it a breach of its duty of neutrality. And one of the Supreme Court justices wrote, and I'll just quote a little bit from his ruling, that sponsorship of one religious tradition by the state is in breach of its duty of neutrality and amounts to discrimination against all other such traditions. And in another place, he wrote, in short, there is a distinction between unbelief and true neutrality. True neutrality presupposes abstention, but it does not amount to a stand favoring one view over another. No such inference can be drawn from the state's silence. So that is an elegant but legalistic way of saying, just because I'm not praying doesn't mean I'm endorsing atheism or privileging non-belief. It's just taking no stand, and um, you can't assume atheism just because you're not going to a prayer. He also wrote that the preamble cannot lead to an interpretation of freedom of conscience and religion that authorizes the state to consciously profess a theistic faith. And in the decades since, just over a decade since this ruling, a few years ago, the BC Humanist Association basically looked up every municipality in British Columbia and Ontario and one other province. They're planning on going across the entire nation and tracked whether they are opening their meetings with a prayer. And many were. And I'm happy to say that after getting a letter from the BCHA, uh, most of them said, okay, well, thanks for letting us know that we're violating a Supreme Court ruling. We're going to stop now. So there have been cities that have been violating this ruling for a long time, but that number is much lower today thanks to the BCHA. So well done. Um, and then there's Trinity Western University. I'm going to try and be fairly brief here, but this is one that I got heavily involved with, and there's a lot of nuance here. So Trinity Western University is a private evangelical Christian university based in British Columbia. It's been around for decades. It wanted to open up a law school, and it got permission from the from the BC government that it could do so, reviewed the curriculum, it was acceptable. Every student, staff member, and faculty had to sign what they called a community covenant. It's about an 8-page document, and among other things, it forbids sexual intimacy outside of marriage, where marriage is defined as between one man and one woman. So what happened is that the law societies of Ontario, Nova Scotia, and British Columbia all said that is so discriminatory that even if you're uh, uh, even if you give someone a law degree, we will not let people graduating from TWU practice law in our province. So Trinity Western University had to sue, and not surprisingly, this made its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. Um, it was a fairly lengthy ruling, over 250 pages. I read the whole thing. But fundamentally, the Supreme Court argued that, or the Supreme Court ruled that discrimination is not a protected religious right. And for the first time, the Supreme Court put in writing that freedom of religion includes freedom from religion. They also wrote that the Charter does not protect measures by which an individual or faith community seeks to impose adherence to their religious beliefs or practices on others who do not share their underlying faith, which means you can't say it's my religious freedom to force you to convert. The minority view wrote that secularism connotes pluralism and respect for diversity, and that it guarantees an inclusive public square by neither privileging nor silencing any single view, and that the secular state is a neutral state, and they reiterate that state neutrality must prevail. Now, ultimately, Trinity Western University, after this ruling, a few years later, decided not to open a law school, and a few years after that, they decided to make signing the community covenant optional for made it optional for students. So, for those that don't feel that those restrictions are not justified, that is good news. And for anyone who wants to see it, I wrote a fairly lengthy analysis of this ruling, so I put a link to that in the chat. All right, so let's have a quick pop quiz. Canada had a blasphemy law, and it has been repealed. If you think you know when it was repealed, you can put it in the chat, or just think about it, and I'll let you know when that happened. So we don't always get change through the courts. There are other ways to affect change in Canada, and this is the case. This is an example of it. So Section 296 of the Criminal Code used to read, everyone who publishes a blasphemous libel is guilty of an indictable offense and liable to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 2 years. Now, the last conviction was in 1927, and it was most recently invoked in 1979 in a failed attempt to censor Monty Python's Life of Brian. So the law was effectively defunct. So why was its eventual repeal a milestone to be celebrated? Well, there are several reasons for this. The philosophical reason is that if you are a believer, isn't saying God needs protection from mortal institutions blasphemous? I mean, God is God. God doesn't need us to protect him, her, it, whatever form God takes. If you happen to be a non-believer, which I believe most humanists are, I mean, blasphemy is the ultimate victimless crime. Now, there are also moral reasons to repeal the law. Immigrants to Canada are very much aware of our laws, and many of them are fleeing repressive regimes. And so they feel uncomfortable, perhaps, criticizing religion, knowing that it is against the law in this nation, and therefore it suppresses speech. Other countries have used Canada as a moral shield for their blasphemy laws. So countries like Saudi Arabia, which has the death penalty for blasphemy, they point to Canada and say, "You too believe it is a criminal offense. You will jail your uh, your offenders. We have a different penalty, but in principle." We agree on this. Ours happens to be a bit more severe, but that's what happens in different countries. So we are providing a moral shield to other countries. Um, and also, if a law is on the books, it could prosecute under that law at any time. Just because they hadn't done it in 4 decades doesn't mean that they won't. And then there was a practical reason. The reason that this no longer exists as a law is that when an Alberta judge convicted a man of murder, um, that judge cited a section of the criminal code that the Supreme Court had previously declared to be unconstitutional. So the law was null and void, but it was still on the books. These are referred to as zombie laws. So in response to this embarrassment, the federal justice minister announced a full review of the criminal code. And so the Canadian Secular Alliance, the Centre for Inquiry Canada, and Humanist Canada banded together, and we met with the senior bureaucrat in the Justice Department in charge of this file. And we brought Canada's blasphemy law to his attention, and we argued that it would, if it was ever challenged, it would almost certainly be found to be unconstitutional. Um, then a bill was introduced that removed all zombie criminal code provisions. And then several months later, there was a second bill introduced that promised to repeal Canada's blasphemy law. And some of the other laws that were repealed in that particular bill was a law forbidding folks to challenge someone to a duel, a law that made it a criminal offense to fraudulently pretend to practice witchcraft and to impersonate somebody during a university exam. So, as part of that omnibus bill, Canada's blasphemy law was repealed on December 13th, 2018. And I wrote a couple of essays about Canada's blasphemy law, and I'll put those in the chat for you. And you can read those at your convenience. So secularism is hardly a dead issue these days. Um, uh, we currently have medical assistance in dying. And when this law was introduced, oops, ah, uh, uh, the debate was about whether people could have any say at all about how much they suffer before they die. And there was a major argument against medical assistance in dying was that man cannot play God by murdering people. The debate continues today, but it's shifted. There's discussions about what are the appropriate conditions for MAID eligibility, whether the procedures we have and the timing when someone decides um, are appropriate, whether they're too restrictive or they're too open. Um, are we excluding people who should have this option, or are we expanding eligibility too quickly? In effect, using MAID as expediency tool to get rid of individuals that would just be too expensive or inconvenient to support to live a life with dignity. This is an ongoing debate, and that debate is happening today. And again, just a couple months ago, there was a podcast for Inquiry episode that discussed the current state of MAID. And so if you're interested, here's a link on the current controversies, the current status, and the current debates that are happening within Canada. And then, of course, there's the issue that, oh my gosh, has split the Canadian secular community like no other in my experience, and that is Quebec's Bill 21. I think it's a terrible misnomer to call it a secularism law, but that's how it's widely known. The most controversial provision of that is that it forbids the wearing of religious symbols if you are a provincial government employee that interacts with the public. The bill was passed in 2019 and was challenged in court immediately. It took nearly 7 years to reach the Supreme Court, which it did just a couple of weeks ago. There are lots of arguments in favor and against this legislation from that are strictly secular from on both sides. I don't want to rehash all of those right now. There's too many to get into. But I will say that there have been 3 Podcast for Inquiry episodes devoted to it, as well as I've published a personal opinion piece about Bill 21 in Free Inquiry, which is the magazine of the Center for Inquiry US. So you can watch or listen to those episodes if you wish, or read my essay if you want. And if you want to have a conversation about this in the Q&A, I'm happy to talk about it. But it's a very complex issue, lots of good arguments on both sides. I definitely have my own opinion, and I'm happy to share that with you. But that said, I do think it's important to acknowledge that Canada has changed. I know I was pretty harsh at the beginning um, of this webinar about who we were at our founding, and I think that that is it's a valid criticism. But just to see how far we've come, in June of 1939, more than 900 Jewish refugees were fleeing Nazi Germany. They were denied entry in Cuba, they were denied entry in the United States, and they were denied entry in Canada. And it forced the liner to return to Europe. Canada admitted nearly no Jewish refugees during the Holocaust when 6 million European Jews were killed. Um, about 5,000 Jews were allowed into Canada between 1933 and 1945, which is the worst in the world for countries that accepted refugees. Um, and then fast forward nearly 70 years, and during the Syrian civil war, our prime minister tweeted, because that's what people did back then, to those fleeing persecution, terror, and war, Canadians will welcome you regardless of your faith. We admitted over 60,000 Syrian refugees, and at this point now, over 250,000 Ukrainian refugees have come to Canada in the last few years. Now, that said, there is more work to be done. I like this quote from George Orwell: "I'd like to start a religion. That's where the money is." L. Ron Hubbard followed Orwell's advice when he founded Scientology. Scientology is recognized as a religion in the United States, but not here in Canada. But that said, the government still provides preferential treatment to religious organizations, overwhelmingly Christian ones. So the Catholic school systems, as I mentioned, remain publicly funded in 3 provinces. Now that's billions of dollars in direct subsidies to Catholic education, which is a perk not available to Presbyterians, Jews, Lutherans, Muslims, Baptists, Hindus, Mormons, Anglicans, Buddhists, and on and on and on. Catholic schools in Ontario forbade gay-straight alliances for years, and forbade them for years after a law was passed specifically dictating that Catholic administrators could not prevent the forming of gay-straight alliances where the student body wanted them. The advancement of religion is recognized as a charitable purpose. The purpose of that, or the impact of that, is that if your organization does nothing but evangelize, try and convert people to your faith, you get to be a charity. Even if you don't feed the poor, or you don't, educate the ignorant, you do nothing that is generally recognized as a charitable act, just evangelize, you get to be a charity. That's the law. I'll put a link in later, but if you want to know the other policies and the impact, the Center for Inquiry Canada published the Cost of Religion in Canada series of reports in Canada, and it's a pretty it lists how religious organizations get funded directly and indirectly by over $5 billion a year. The housing tax deduction for clergy, that's $100 million per year. Place of worship and lands used in connection to a house of worship are exempt from property taxes, about $900 million per year. So we're talking about a lot, just a huge subsidy given to religious organizations. Uh, and then, of course, as I've mentioned before, we have God in the Charter and the national anthem. And in a few months, the census will be coming out. And on the census, on the long form census, which is sent out to about a quarter of Canadian households, that um, the question on religion is a little bit biased. It asks you to check or to indicate your religion, even if you are no longer a practicing member. So you can put down humanist. There's a place for you to write humanist. You can tick off no religion. So that option is available. But the text, even if you are no longer a practicing member, basically means that for most people who just read the text and follow it, they will indicate the faith that they grew up in, the faith of their parents. And so we don't know by how much the census understates the irreligion in Canada, but given the bias of the question, it is certain that it does. So secularism, in short, which is ironic given the length of this presentation, but secularism is the compromise position that ensures maximal freedom for all. If if it's applied consistently, secularism prevents discriminations against a particular faith. It prevents favoritism towards members of a specific sect to the detriment of others, and it forbids the treating of non-believers differently than believers. Secularism should be boring. It should be invisible. It should be like turning on the tap and getting clean water, flipping a switch and having the light turn on. It should just be there. And as a result, I think government neutrality in matters of religion is something that everybody of every faith and of no faith should support, even if only for selfish reasons. Now, in my view, there are two pillars of secularism. There's the legal and institutional. These are the laws and the regulations that govern the country, and then the cultural, the individual. This is the zeitgeist, how the hearts and minds, and this is how people think government should react. Now, one can lead the other. You can get the legal ahead of the cultural, or get the cultural ahead of the legal. But if they get too far out of sync, it's likely to snap back to the previous status quo. Um, I mentioned before that it was freedom of religion that led to equal marriage in Canada. Now, that only happened after decades of grassroots activism that led to a gradual but consistent lessening of the societal taboo on homosexual relationships. When the first marriage took place in the church, taking advantage of a loophole, it was by a means of the reading of the banns, which is an archaic way of declaring this is where the uh, uh, if anyone has an objection to this marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace. That's essentially what the reading of the banns was like. So they did that in a church, no one objected, and legally they were married. This was done to marry two men. And then this led to provincial decisions in Canada, starting in Ontario in 2003. And then federal law recognized same sex marriage 2 years later.
Mm.
Now, at the time, Canadians were evenly divided about whether Canada should allow same sex marriage. When it was being debated, one poll had 46 in favor, 48 against. The next poll had those reversed, and small numbers said they don't know. 15 years later, over three-quarters of Canadians now support it. So that means tens of millions of Canadians have changed their mind in a decade and a half, and that's just fantastic, and that is just continuing to proceed. So it's just important that we have to work on both levels. We can't just work on one. Lasting change occurs when the legal and institutional and the cultural move together. So if you want more, please, there's lots of things to discuss. You can learn more at the Centre for Inquiry Canada, and the link is there on Blue Sky, the Canadian Secular Alliance. If you want more of me, wow, great. There's the podcast for Inquiry. We've been doing that for almost 4.5 years now. New episodes every 2 weeks, including the most recent episode that just came out this morning. And so I encourage you to go to our YouTube channel. If you like to watch podcasts or however you get your podcasts, please subscribe. My writings are available on opinions and questions. And I'm also on Blue Sky, although I don't tend to post very much. I tend more to read. So that is history of secularism in Canada. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned, and I hope you have lots of questions because I would like the rest of the evening to be a discussion rather than a monologue. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you so much, Leslie, for spending your evening with us and that wonderful presentation. I'm going to now turn off the recording.